The first notice showed up on a Monday morning, taped to my front door like a scarlet letter. Noise violation, excessive dog barking. My dog, Jasper, a 12-year-old beagle mix who spent most of his time asleep on the couch, had apparently become the neighborhood menace overnight. I stood there in my robe, holding my coffee, staring at the letter like it was written in another language. "Are you kidding me?" I muttered, looking over at Jasper, who was snoring softly in his dog bed like he'd just run a marathon. It didn't take long to figure out who filed the complaint. Darla McKinney, president of the Oakmill Ridge Homeowners Association. Mid-50s, stiff blonde hair sprayed into a helmet and a voice that could shatter glass. She lived 3 houses down and had been gunning for me since the day I moved in. Probably because I didn't show up to her little monthly HOA meetings with the rest of the Stepford crowd, I called the number listed at the bottom of the notice, hoping I'd get someone reasonable. "HOA office," a chipper voice answered. "Yeah, hi. This is Weston Briggs. I live at 227 Pinebrush Lane. I just got a noise violation about my dog. I think there's been a mistake." There was a pause. "Ah, yes, that was filed by our president, Miss McKinney." She submitted a formal complaint along with an affidavit and said she recorded the barking. "Recorded?" I blinked. "Jasper barely barks unless someone's at the door." "Well, she says it's been disrupting her sleep." "The fine is $75 for the first offense." I hung up without another word. That evening I walked Jasper past Darla's house. Her porch lights were blazing and I could hear music thumping faintly from inside. Typical. I glanced at Jasper. Disrupting her sleep, the truth. Darla throws parties. Not the kind with balloons and charcuterie boards. I'm talking drunken wine nights with her clique of HOA cronies and their husbands, loud music, and the occasional karaoke screech fest that carries down the block. Usually on Thursdays. Sometimes Fridays. Always past midnight. And here's what really got under my skin: Jasper had arthritis. He rarely barked, let alone caused any kind of racket, but I'd been fined based on a noise complaint from the loudest house on the block. That's when I decided I wasn't just going to pay the fine and move on. If Darla wanted to play this game, I was going to beat her at it. The next Thursday night, I stayed up. At 11:15, I heard it, bass rattling from her speakers, laughter, clinking glasses. I stepped out onto my front lawn with my phone in hand and hit record. I caught a full 5 minutes of her and her friends belting out some off-key rendition of Sweet Caroline. That was just the beginning. I did it again the next week, and the week after that. I logged every noise, every party, every time her guests parked on the street overnight in violation of HOA rules. I documented each one with timestamps, videos, and decibel readings from a free app I downloaded. After 3 weeks, I had a folder on my desktop labeled McKinney Mayhem. I printed out everything, including screenshots of the HOA bylaws which Darla herself had mailed to every homeowner last year, and highlighted every rule she was breaking. I stapled it all together, wrote a polite cover letter, and dropped it off at the HOA office with a copy addressed to the board. A week later, I got a call. "Mr. Briggs," said a tired-sounding man who introduced himself as Gary, one of the HOA board members. "We reviewed your report. Honestly, we had no idea things had gotten this out of hand. There's going to be a hearing next Monday. You're welcome to attend." I did, and boy, was it worth it. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse. Folding chairs, lukewarm coffee, and a sad tray of cookies. Darla sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, already looking like she'd swallowed a lemon. I walked in with my folder under one arm and Jasper's leash in the other. He waddled beside me, wearing the little blue vest he got from the vet that marked him as a senior service animal. Darla's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Briggs," she said without even pretending to be polite. "This isn't a place for pets." "He's here as a witness," I said deadpan. "And technically he's quieter than your last karaoke night." A few board members chuckled. I handed out copies of my report. For the next 20 minutes, we listened to audio clips of her parties, reviewed video footage of her guests stumbling out at 1 in the morning, and highlighted bylaws she'd repeatedly violated. Gary cleared his throat. "Miss McKinney, this is quite a lot," she tried to deflect. "This is all taken out of context. He's clearly retaliating because he was fined for his dog." I leaned forward. "The fine was based on your affidavit. No other neighbors complained. And I've got written statements from the 2 houses next to mine saying they've never heard Jasper bark once." Darla turned red. "This is ridiculous. I've been a pillar of this community for over 10 years, and you've been breaking your own rules for most of them." Another board member, a quiet woman named Elaine who lived on the same street, raised her hand. "To be honest, we've all heard the parties. I just didn't think we could say anything since you're the president." That's when the room shifted. I could feel it. People realizing that maybe Darla wasn't the untouchable queen bee she thought she was. Gary leaned back. "Well, we're going to have to vote on this, Miss McKinney. I'm afraid this may constitute multiple fines and possibly a temporary suspension from the board while we investigate." She sputtered. "You can't be serious." No one looked at her. I walked out of that meeting with Jasper trotting beside me and a little bounce in my step. By the time I got home, there was a new notice on my door. HOA board hearing results fine dismissed. But I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Because the deeper I dug into the HOA's paper trail, the more I realized Darla had been doing a whole lot more than just throwing loud parties. 3 days after the hearing, I received an envelope in the mail with no return address, just my name written in shaky pen. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A typed list of expense approvals signed by Darla over the past year. The ink was faded in spots, and some of the entries were circled in red, including one that read Community Beautification Consultant $2,400 and another, Administrative Equipment Lease $3,800. At the bottom was a handwritten note, "Check with the treasurer." Some of these payments don't exist in the official budget. There was no signature. I stood on my porch staring at the paper, Jasper sitting beside me like a silent co-conspirator. Someone inside that HOA wanted her gone but couldn't or wouldn't go public. And now, apparently, I was the one carrying the torch. I folded the paper and tucked it into my jacket. I knew who the treasurer was. Ron Talbot, lived across the creek and had an air of someone who'd been waiting for retirement since the day he was born. I'd seen him at the hearing, quiet, always scribbling something in his little spiral notebook. I caught him watering his azaleas that afternoon. "Ron," I said, stepping up to the edge of his lawn, "you got a minute?" He turned, blinking behind thick glasses. "Weston, is it?" I nodded and handed him the paper. His eyes roved over the list. When he got to the second circled item, he let out a breath through his nose. "I've never approved these." He shook the sheet slightly. "That consultant, that's her niece. She never attended a single meeting, but somehow she billed the HOA nearly $2.5 grand for a report on aesthetic cohesion. Did you report it?" I brought it up in a closed session. Darla called it a clerical error and moved on. His voice dropped. "She's been stonewalling us for months. Signs contracts without a second signature, allocates funds without votes. If you bring it up, she threatens to have your property re-inspected." I didn't say anything, but the gears in my head were turning. "If someone were to collect documentation," I said carefully, "how far could that go?" Ron met my eyes. "Depends how thorough it is, and whether you can prove she's pocketing HOA money." I thanked him and walked back to my house, heart pounding. I wasn't just dealing with a power-hungry neighbor anymore. This was something bigger. Something that could unravel her entire little empire. That night, I went through every HOA notice I'd ever received. I dug out newsletters, scanned PDFs, and even pulled cached versions of the neighborhood's website. I started building a timeline, one that showed when money was spent, what it was supposedly for, and when. A pattern emerged. Every time Darla signed off on a payment over $2,000, there was no record of a vote, just her signature and a vague description. I pulled property records and found that the equipment leasing company listed didn't exist. I checked the business registration number. It had been deactivated 2 years ago. Someone was cooking the books. The next day, I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in years. "Weston Briggs," said the voice on the other end. "I thought you fell off the face of the earth." "I need a favor," I said, "and before you say no, it involves financial fraud, an HOA president, and potentially misuse of community funds." There was a pause. "I'm listening." Her name was Marla. We'd gone to college together. She became a forensic accountant for a private audit firm downtown. She owed me for covering a statistics final she skipped to follow a band on tour. I'd never cashed in on it. Until now, I scanned over the documents and sent her the folder. 3 days later, she called me back. "She's clever," she said. "But not clever enough. She's funneling funds through shell vendors. Most of the checks are made out to companies that don't exist. Know what that means? She's embezzling. Bingo. At least 15 to 20 grand over the last 14 months. If this was a corporate board, she'd be in cuffs by Monday." "Could you write me a summary? Something I could show the board?" "I can do better," she said. "Give me 2 days." By the weekend, I had a full audit report, clean. Professional. Every entry backed by public records and bank data. It even included a list of vendors with matching addresses to Darla's relatives. I felt like I was holding a bomb wrapped in manila cardstock. I didn't go to the HOA board with it directly. I knew better than to walk into another meeting and hand her the rope to untie herself. Instead, I went to Elaine. She was the quiet board member who'd spoken up at the last hearing. She and I had barely exchanged more than a few words before that, but I remembered the way she'd looked at Darla during the meeting like someone who just realized the emperor had no clothes. I caught her outside her garage on Sunday, pulling weeds from the flower bed. "I need to show you something," I said, handing her the envelope. She went inside to read it. When she came back out, her face was pale. "Is this real?" "Yes." She stared at the folder like it might bite her. "You need to bring this to a vote." "A special session." "She'll shut it down." "Not if we call it without her. Bylaws allow any 2 board members to call a special meeting with 72 hours notice. I'll get Ron. You show up with this." That's how we planned it. The meeting was set for the following Wednesday. It wasn't in the clubhouse, it was in Ron's backyard, under the pretense of a board subcommittee discussion. Word spread fast. By the time I arrived, there were over 30 homeowners milling around with folding chairs and soda cans, whispering to each other. Darla showed up last, wearing a lavender blouse and fake smile, looking completely unaware. "Interesting location," she said, glancing around. Elaine stepped forward. "We're invoking Article 6, subsection C. This is a special session called without the president's approval per HOA bylaws." Darla's mouth twitched. "That's not how we usually—" "It's legal," Ron said, "and you're not running this meeting." She opened her mouth again, but I stepped forward and handed him the report. "This is an independent audit of the Oakmill Ridge HOA financial records," I said, voice steady. "It outlines a pattern of unauthorized spending, unapproved vendor payments, and possible embezzlement." The crowd went dead silent. Ron started reading. As he listed off the payments, consulting fees, fake equipment leases, landscaping contracts with no corresponding work orders, people started murmuring. I saw one guy near the back pull out his phone and start recording. Darla's face had gone stiff, her hands clenched. "You can't prove any of this," she said, but her voice cracked. "I don't have to," I said. "We've already sent the report to the county's Department of Regulatory Compliance. They're opening an investigation." That was the moment the crowd turned. "You've been using our dues to pay your family," someone shouted. Another voice called out, "Where's the rest of the money, Darla?" She tried to shout over them, but it was too late. The board voted unanimously to suspend her duties pending the outcome of the investigation. A week later, a notice went out to the entire neighborhood. Darla McKinney was no longer president of the Oakmill Ridge HOA. I didn't see her again after that, but a new election was scheduled. And this time, people actually showed up. The morning after Darla was officially removed, the neighborhood felt different. Not in the birds sing sweeter way, but in a charged, cautious kind of way, like a brittle silence right before a thunderstorm. Cars rolled a little slower past my driveway. People who used to avert their eyes started nodding at me. One guy even gave me a thumbs up walking his golden retriever. It wasn't celebration, not yet. It was the kind of quiet recalibration people go through when the rules suddenly shift and they realize they could have spoken up all along. I didn't expect to be part of the next phase. I assumed I'd done my part, pulled the pin, and walked away from the blast. But by Thursday, Elaine was on my doorstep holding a clipboard and a narrow envelope. "You're running." "No, I'm not." She didn't move. "Ron's stepping down after the interim period. We need someone who's actually read the bylaws, preferably someone who doesn't treat the HOA budget like a slot machine." "I'm not a politician." "You don't need to be. You just need to show up and not screw people over." I looked at the envelope. "What's this?" "Nomination form, 3 signatures, and it's official." I took it, mostly to get her off the porch. Jasper barked once, probably annoyed she was blocking the breeze from the screen door. I scratched behind his ears and told him not to worry. We weren't jumping into any more neighborhood drama. That lasted about 4 hours. I walked into the local grocery store later that afternoon and ran into Greg Harlan, a landscaper who lived a few streets over. He was in the middle of stacking bags of mulch into his truck bed and waved me over. I hadn't spoken to him since the HOA incident, but he gave me a look like we were co-conspirators in some underground movement. "You hear about the invoices?" he asked, voice low. "What invoices?" "The ones Darla signed off on for my crew to reseed the clubhouse lawn last spring. We never got called, found out from my cousin who's on the grounds maintenance rotation. She marked us down for $2,000. I blinked. $2,000, he nodded, for work we never even quoted. She used our company name. We're looking into whether she forged the approval signature. Did you take it to the board?" He glanced around. I tried, got brushed off with "we're handling it internally." That phrase made my stomach twist. I thanked him and left, walking out of the store with a half cart of groceries and a head full of questions. If Darla had been faking vendor payments that went beyond family, if she was using real businesses without their knowledge, that was a whole different level of fraud. And if the new interim board wasn't pursuing it, someone else needed to. That night, I filled out the nomination form. I dropped it at Elaine's house the next morning. She didn't say anything when she opened the door, just took the envelope, nodded once, and closed it again with the quiet satisfaction of someone who just won a long bet. The week leading up to the election was uneventful on the surface. No flyers, no debates, no door-to-door handshaking. Most of the neighborhood seemed exhausted by the drama and wanted stability more than anything else. But I started hearing things, a few whispered conversations near mailboxes, mentions of Darla's name resurfacing in odd ways. It wasn't until I got an anonymous email from a dummy account that I realized she wasn't completely out. The subject line said, "Thought you should know." Attached was a screenshot of a group message thread. I didn't recognize the names, but the conversation was clear. "Things will go back to normal once we get someone in we can work with. Elaine's not going to last another term. We just need to get Weston out of the way." No one used last names, but the tone was unmistakable. This wasn't just sour grapes, it was a coordinated effort to reinstall someone friendly to Darla's old system. The problem with power vacuums is that someone always wants to fill them. I printed the screenshot, not to show anyone yet, but to remind myself that this wasn't over. Then I started doing what I do best, digging. I pulled up public campaign filings. Technically, HOA board seats didn't require the same disclosures as city council spots, but anyone who collected donations had to list them. 2 other people had filed last minute, a guy named Mitch Riener and a woman named Pam Laskin. Both had been quiet during the Darla fallout. Too quiet in hindsight. I remembered seeing Mitch at one of the late-night hearings. He'd sat with his arms crossed the whole time, never spoke, just watched. Pam lived in one of the newer cul-de-sacs, the ones Darla had allegedly approved without community input. I found her name on a permit approval for a backyard pool that had been greenlit in under 48 hours, an unusually fast turnaround. I started canvassing, not with campaign signs but with questions. I talked to neighbors, asked if they'd heard anything about the election, whether they knew who Mitch or Pam were. Most didn't. The few who did just shrugged. They said they want to bring efficiency back to the HOA, one woman told me while trimming her hedge. Whatever that means. I knew exactly what it meant. I compiled everything I'd found, every questionable permit, every fast-tracked approval, every HOA expense that had linked back to either of them. Nothing illegal on its own, but together it painted a picture. Darla might have been ousted, but her network was trying to slide right back in through the side door. At the next community meeting 2 days before the vote, I stood up during the open forum. "There's no agenda tonight," Elaine said, looking around the room, "but if anyone has something to bring forward, now's the time." I raised my hand. "I do," she nodded. I walked to the front with a manila folder. "I don't have a speech," I said. "Just a few things I think people should know before they vote." Then I laid out the facts. I passed around copies of the permits. I showed the pool approval with a timestamp that didn't match the HOA's weekly review cycle. I listed the vendor payments Mitch had signed off on as a volunteer project lead payments that never resulted in actual work. I displayed the screenshot from the anonymous email. "This isn't about me winning," I said. "It's about making sure we don't let the same system sneak in wearing a new face." The room was quiet. No outbursts, no applause, just a long, heavy silence as people read through the pages. After the meeting, Pam left without saying a word. Mitch stayed behind and tried to explain away the permits, but no one was listening. The vote happened the next evening. When the results came in, I wasn't surprised. I won by a landslide. But that wasn't the victory. The real win came a week later, when the new board, Elaine, myself, and 2 others who had no ties to the previous regime, voted to initiate a full forensic audit of the last 3 years. We didn't just send it to the Department of Regulatory Compliance. This time, we hired an independent firm to track every cent. We rewrote the bylaws to require dual signatures on all expenditures over $500. We opened board meetings to community attendance. We even launched an online portal for residents to track where their dues were going. Slowly, the neighborhood began to heal. The parties stopped not because we banned them, but because the people who hosted them knew they couldn't get away with it anymore. The fines became fair, consistent, and appealable. Transparency became the norm, and Jasper, he still slept through most of it, occasionally lifting his head only when it mattered, just like I had. The new board had barely settled into their roles when the first audit report came in. Elaine handed it to me in a plain envelope, her expression unreadable except for the faint tension in her jaw. We sat at the long rectangular table in the newly cleaned-out HOA office. Darla's framed President of the Year plaque had been taken down, leaving a square of lighter paint behind. I flipped the packet open. The header read, "Summary of Findings Oakmill Ridge HOA Expenditures Fiscal Years, Prior 3. The language was dry, but the numbers weren't. Over $71,000 misallocated. At least 9 vendors had no tax IDs. 3 payments were traced to a checking account registered under a company dissolved 5 years ago, one that shared an address with Darla's sister-in-law. There were even reimbursements for event supplies that matched receipts from a boutique wine store in the next town over. All unapproved. All signed by Darla." Elaine leaned forward. "The investigator said this is the worst case of internal HOA fraud he's seen in over a decade. She's going to face charges, right? She might, but there's a problem." "What kind?" Elaine opened a second folder. "Some of the paperwork is missing. Originals are gone: meeting minutes, authorization forms, vendor contracts." She must have destroyed them when she realized she was getting squeezed out. So what do we have? Enough to trigger a formal complaint with the county, but not enough for a slam-dunk criminal prosecution. It's going to come down to whether we can prove intent. That's not good enough. She looked at me, eyes narrowing. Then we need to find someone who saw her do it. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept turning over the names in my head, the board members who'd quit over the last 2 years, the ones who stopped attending meetings, even the neighbors who'd always seemed on the fringe. Someone had to know more than they were saying. I started with the name that had shown up repeatedly in the audit report, Lacey Harmon. She'd been listed as event coordinator on 6 different payments, all for planning community enrichment nights. I remembered one of those nights, a wine tasting event that lasted 20 minutes before being shut down for lack of permits. The rest never happened. I found her address in the directory. Duplex, edge of the neighborhood, curtains always drawn. I knocked twice. The door opened a crack, then all the way she looked surprised to see me. Early 30s, tight ponytail, dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't been sleeping much either. "You're the guy who brought Darla down," she said, not a question. "I'm Weston." "I know who you are. Can we talk?" She hesitated, then stepped aside. Her living room was sparsely decorated. A camping chair instead of a couch, folding table with a laptop and a stack of unopened mail. She offered no small talk, just sat and waited. "I saw your name in the audit. You were listed as having coordinated several HOA events." She laughed bitterly. "I never planned anything. Darla asked to use my name so she could streamline approvals, said the board was too slow. I didn't think anything of it. Then I started getting calls from vendors about unpaid invoices. Did you sign anything? She had me sign a W-9, said it was just for tax purposes. Did she pay you? Once. $200. Then she ghosted me. Would you be willing to make a statement? She looked at the wall for a long time, then nodded. Yeah, I'm done covering for her. She used me. I left with her signed affidavit in my glove compartment, hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. It was the first real piece of the puzzle that could hold up. But it wasn't enough. I needed more. The next lead came unexpectedly. A man named Felix Barker walked into the HOA office during open hours. Middle-aged, wore a delivery company polo and carried a small notebook. You Weston? Yeah. I used to drop off audio equipment at the clubhouse. Speakers, mics, amps, always cash, no receipts. You worked for the HOA, not officially. Darla found me through a friend. Paid me to bring stuff in before her board mixers. I stopped when she stiffed me on a New Year's rental. Do you have records? He pulled out the notebook. Dates, locations, gear list. I keep track for tax reasons. Would you testify to this? If it means I get my $500 back, sure. By the time the next board meeting rolled around, I had a stack of statements. They painted a picture of not just mismanagement, but calculated deception. Darla had used HOA funds like a personal piggy bank, counting on the apathy and fear of the community to keep her safe. We called for a formal vote to refer the matter to the county attorney's office. The vote passed unanimously. That night, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. Her voice came through the receiver, sharp and clipped. You think you've won, Weston, but you have no idea who you're dealing with. I didn't respond right away. I walked to the back porch, phone pressed to my ear, looking out over Jasper snoozing in the grass. You called me, I said at last. That means you're worried. I built this neighborhood. You think you can undo that with a few spreadsheets? You didn't build it. You used it. That's over. She hung up, but not before I heard her voice catch, not with fear, but something close to desperation. The county launched a full investigation 2 weeks later. Subpoenas went out. Former board members were questioned. Vendors were interviewed. The local paper ran a story. HOA president under investigation for fraud, misuse of funds. Neighbors who used to avoid eye contact stopped by to ask how they could help. One offered drone footage of a backyard construction project Darla had approved without permits. Another dropped off screenshots of messages where she'd promised favors in exchange for votes. It was like the community had snapped out of a spell. On the day the charges were filed, I stood outside the clubhouse with Elaine, watching as a pair of investigators boxed up files. It wasn't dramatic. No handcuffs, no shouting, just a quiet, methodical end to a long con. Lane glanced over at me. "You could have walked away." I wanted to, I really did. "Why didn't you?" I thought of Jasper, of the way Darla had used even his silence as a weapon. Of the neighbors she'd intimidated, the rules she twisted, the money she stole. Because someone had to stand up. She nodded once. "You did more than that." The next election, I didn't run again. I didn't need to. The board was full of people who actually cared now, people who showed up, asked questions, listened. The bylaws were clearer, the meetings shorter, the fines fair, and the neighborhood, it finally belonged to the people who lived there. I spent more time walking Jasper, who was now moving a little slower but still sniffed every fire hydrant like it held secrets. People waved. Some stopped to talk. Others just smiled and nodded. No one ever mentioned Darla again, and that was the real victory.